This year, the topic of de-escalation training, preventative measures, and institutional reconstruction are highly relevant in the world of law enforcement. Today, we're joined by John Bostain. John is president of Command Presence Training. He has committed the last 26 years to law enforcement, 24 of which have been a trainer. He has trained more than 25,000 law enforcement professionals at the state, local, federal, and international level, and is a frequent speaker at national law enforcement conferences. I am Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Police. This is the Blue View. John, welcome, and thanks for joining us today on the Blue View podcast. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hey, thank you so much for having me. And I love the FOP. I had a chance to present at the National FOP Conference a couple of years ago in Indianapolis. So it's really, truly an honor to be on your podcast today and talking about the challenges. So my name is John Bostain. I'm the owner of Command Presence Training. We're headquartered down in Brunswick, Georgia. And I started my law enforcement career in a place called Hampton, Virginia, and enjoyed a really good career there. Spent time in uniform patrol, narcotics. I was a police academy instructor, which has really kind of started my juices about being an instructor, SWAT team member and a detective and a patrol supervisor before I left in 2001. And I joined the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, also known as FLETC in Glencoe, Georgia. So I was a trainer at FLETC for 13 years. Most of my time, I was the senior instructor for use of force training. I also worked in the Rural Policing Institute and some other divisions as well. Started off teaching defensive tactics. So in 2014, I decided 25 total years of government service was enough and decided to go out and venture on my own and still serve the law enforcement community, only this time as a full-time law enforcement trainer with my own company. So that's just a kind of the thumbnail. That should be enough to get us started.
Absolutely, and thank you for your years of service in law enforcement. Hey, John, let's just dive right into it. You know, last year, 2022, was one of the most dangerous years for law enforcement. There were 331 police officers who shot in the line of duty. It's data that the Fraternal Order of Police has been tracking for about 6 years now. And when you compare it to 2019, when things really kind of turned for law enforcement profession, COVID and all of the unrest. That's a 13% increase from that year. The Manhattan Institute says that anti-police rhetoric is one of the key factors, one of the leading factors in assaults on law enforcement officers. Very challenging times that we're in. In your perspective, what do you see as our biggest challenges in trying to turn the tide on public perception and attacks and lack of respect for law enforcement officers?
Yes, it's a great question. And so I have to agree that at least when I travel to the United States and I'm talking to people, as a general rule, most of the officers that are in class, they're still positive about the job, but you can sense this underlying frustration. I think the Manhattan Institute is 100% correct, where that anti-law enforcement sentiment might be driving some of the challenges. And quite honestly, it seems to me in society that there's just a lack of respect for law enforcement, or more importantly, maybe just the law in general. And not to get hyper political, but we are seeing a lot of legislation across the United States that wants to minimize consequences for criminal behavior. There is no other way to say that. So there are places where, you get arrested for something, and I think it used to be bad, but we used to joke that people were out before the paperwork was finished. Now it's a reality. And so I think some of this has to do with legislation. I honestly don't understand what the legislatures are thinking sometimes, what the upside of and I don't say necessarily soft on crime. It really tends to be no consequence legislation for criminal behavior. So this certainly has had an impact. And the other thing about officers being murdered in the line of duty and officers being shot in the line of duty is it's really important to remember, and I talk about this in a lot of our classes. I think it's really important to remember this is not anecdotal. This is not just a gut feeling that we have. The data bears it out. I used to be a Below 100 instructor. I was one of the original Below 100 instructors. And for 20 plus years, the leading cause of law enforcement line of duty deaths was vehicle related incidents. That's simply not true anymore. I'd have to double check the data, but I think it's 4 of the last 5 years, gunfire is leading the way. So we need to recognize it for the actual threat that it is. And so I think that number one, we have to recognize that. Number two, when we talk about what can we do about it, it's time to engage the community and, quite honestly, engage the right people. And here's what I mean by that. We tend to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to pacify a very small group of vocal anti-law enforcement people. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at the research, people still in general have a high regard for law enforcement. Most studies that you see out there still rank them right behind the military when it comes to the profession. Now, anybody that's listening, I know it doesn't feel like that right now, because the reality is the small percentage of people get all the noise or all the news and the attention, and they make the most noise. I heard a great term the other day, though. I was talking to somebody, and they used the term slacktivist instead of activist, slacktivist. And what he meant by that is, you have some hardcore activists out there who just really hate the police, but then there seems to be a huge chunk of slacktivists. And what they mean is they're not really committed to the anti-police cause. They'll show up because they want to be part of something, but they really aren't hardcore anti-law enforcement people. So I think when I talk about engaging people, those are the people we've got to try and figure out how to engage and talk with and see where their perspective comes from. Now, again, it seems like we spend the most amount of time trying to get people who are just never going to believe any of the data. We know the data, right? When it comes to use of force, there's no question about it that officers use force, specifically deadly force, in a statistically insignificant number of contacts with the public. It's very, very rare, but that's not the perception. But what we need to do is engage the community, whether it's citizens police academies or forums, or quite honestly, my preference is arm the frontline officer with more information about the realities of use of force. And so they can have that conversation right on the corner as they're talking to people. I know you've had Jason Lehman on before. I think Jason Lehman's spot on that when we clear a call, instead of just jumping in our car going 10-8, obviously, there's times we have to do that. But hey, if we've got 10, 15 minutes, don't get back in your car. Go talk to people in the neighborhood. Help them understand the realities about use of force. Help them understand the realities about why some minorities we may perceive that more of them are getting stopped than others. A lot of times that has to do with the calls for service and the people in that community calling for it. So I think that one of the things we can do is educate our frontline officers to have more intelligent conversations about the realities of policing. And then Malcolm Gladwell, he calls it the tipping point. I think that we may have 40% of the 50% of the country that already strongly supports the police, maybe even more. How about we go, try to attract those other 30, 40% to our side by just being educated about the realities of use of force and law enforcement in general?
You covered a lot of ground there. There's quite a few things I'd like to. No, it's good. It's good discussion, and it's spot on everything you said. I just like to kind of back up a little bit and talk about some of those things.
Yeah.
You talk about the interaction with the public on calls. Look, every law enforcement officer, I think the morale is low now for law enforcement because we don't feel appreciated.
Yep.
What we need to do is, I think everyone in life, not just law enforcement officers, we need to know that what we do is important and what we do is appreciated. And so that kind of addresses the sort of morale of law enforcement officers, but it also applies to the communities as well.
Yeah,
they need to know that what they do is important and that they're appreciated. So that interaction after those calls are spot on. And you're right, Jason has a powerful program that more and more communities should embrace, because really it is, it's a force multiplier.
Right.
We grow law enforcement when we work together. If you look at the cities who have really a good cohesive group in the criminal justice system where every spoke of that wheel is doing their part, then the community feels valued and crime is low. The places where we have one spoke a little bent, a little bit off, then it has a profound impact. I'd also like to just agree with you that poll after poll after poll shows that the vast majority of Americans appreciate and support law enforcement. As much as 84% recognize that the whole defunding movement, that ship has sailed, that it's ridiculous, that it made no sense whatsoever. And in reality, what it did, that failed experiment, has caused our communities to be less and less safe and our jobs less safe. And statistics prove that. You're right.
Yep.
Numbers are impersonal. They don't care whether you like them or not. They're going to tell you the truth. So data tells us, data is what our what our profession is driven by. And it supports everything that you just said. You're spot on. Let's talk a little bit about, so we talk about that interaction. We talk about techniques that can be trained to, training officers. The modern officer today is dealing with a lot more than they've ever done before. I did this job for 36 years. You yourself have a long career in law enforcement, and you've seen a lot in the evolution during that period of time. But law enforcement today is it's a different animal.
Oh yeah.
It's a different approach. Our very existence as law enforcement officers is directly related to the trust of our community. And if we've learned anything in the last 2 years, we've learned that we have some work to do in a lot of cities.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of training on how, your approach to having our officers, the training necessary in order to be able to have that interaction and have positive outcomes with the general public. Because the reality is most of the people we're dealing with, we're catching them on their worst day.
Yeah.
They're dealing with some type of trauma. They need to feel like they're valued. They need to feel like it's important, that they're important. And so it's a mindset. And it's the things that we do in doing our job can go a long ways in building that public trust, especially in the communities that are struggling the most.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about some of those techniques.
Yeah, and so just to kind of piggyback on something you say, really it's about building relationships. And when I say the right people have to engage the right people, no offense to any chiefs or sheriffs or anything like that out there, but the chief or sheriff showing up to a community meeting to talk to the community and then 10 minutes later and leaving. That's not how we build relationships with the people in those communities, right? Also, from the civilian side or the public side of things, just because somebody happens to be a pastor doesn't mean that they speak for that community. I think the relationships are built primarily with patrol officers or community service officers and one-on-one interactions and relationships. When I was patrolling in Hampton, Virginia, I found the most influential person in the entire neighborhood to be grandmama. Right. She was more influential than anybody else. And so I think that's where we have to be building relationships, be intentional about building relationships with people. And honestly, some of it requires us to do some things different, but the public as well. But what can we do differently? I think we start spending some time in areas where we're uncomfortable, meaning maybe it is, off duty, occasionally going to a baseball game or a football game or a fair or something that happens in our district, just so that we're seen there. And I think that helps build relationships. So I think that's kind of the key thing that we need to be thinking about. And obviously, that it works both ways, right? And I will tell you, it makes the difference. You pointed out some of our cities after the George Floyd and some other incidents, they descended into absolute chaos, rioting, and just absolute terrible things. Right, absolutely. But I'll just give you a quick example. I live here in Brunswick, Georgia. And even though it wasn't a police issue, it was a major national issue when it was the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. Now, it made national news. And quite honestly, because that incident involved a former law enforcement officer. You know how that goes, right? If it's a former, then automatically it's a law enforcement issue, right? They make that connection right away. Now, we had two different trials here, right in Brunswick, Georgia, literally 2 blocks away from where I'm coming to you from right now, our office in downtown Brunswick. And here's why I bring this up, is that our local civic groups, our NAACP, our local law enforcement, they had such a strong relationship that we had no problems. I mean, we had there was no riots. I'm not even sure that there were any arrests. All the demonstrations were 100% peaceful. To me, that can only occur because of relationships that had been built well before the trial started.
Well in advance. Yeah, I have a say. I live in South Louisiana, so those people who are in the South can appreciate this analogy that I use. But I've always said that it's difficult to build excitement out of building levees when the sun's out. And levees keep water out of our houses. And the analogy is that it's difficult to keep this relationship and build these relationships, because that's really when you need to do your work. When the storms do come, you need to have that protection in place, and you can't build a levee when the storm's here.
Right.
So that's, maybe an analogy that only applies to a handful of people that are actually watching this, but there's a lot of truth to that. You can't put a roof on your house the day it's raining.
Right.
You need to do it in advance in anticipation of those days, those relationships that you build. I've always said, and I say it quite often, it doesn't matter what profession you're in. You can be a doctor, you can be a painter, you can be a printer, you can be anything. At the end of the day, it's not so much the product and the services that we provide. It really is a relationship we build.
Absolutely.
That get us long run, because we're never, especially in policing, we're never going to always get it on a mark.
No.
It's just it's too fluid. There's too many. There's a human element involved, and because it's a human element, you're always going to have those. It really is all about those relationships. So I appreciate your comment on that, and it's I couldn't be more agreeable in the fact that again, it goes back to how I started this.
Right.
People want to know, they want to feel valued, and they want to feel like what they're doing is important.
Yeah. So let me answer your question about, what are some things that we teach or how do we go about it? We do a program called Dynamics of Officer-Citizen Encounters. And I'll tell you just a little bit about where it came from. My goal when we developed that program about 5 years ago was to figure out, okay, how can I increase officer safety while simultaneously increasing the quality of contacts that we have with the public? And now there'll be a lot of argument there, right? Hey, if I'm going to be super safe, it's going to have to come at the detriment of my interaction with people, or I can interact with people in a really high level, officer friendly, but I have to give up some of my officer safety. And our premise is that it's not a either or, that we can actually do both. And so we started thinking about what gets us in trouble, both safety wise and then with the public. And we came up with an acronym, and this is actually how we teach the program. The acronym is CLEAR, CLEAR. And we believe if the officers do those 5 things in most circumstances, I'm careful about this, right? Because I know the cynics out there. I'm not talking about when somebody rolls out of a car and starts shooting at us. I'm talking on domestics, average citizen contact. If we do these 5 things in the Think Clear approach, I think we'll have better quality contacts and we'll be safer. So what is C? So C is communication. I don't think there's any argument there that sometimes things go south because law enforcement officers, sometimes we don't communicate as well as we should. So I don't think that's a huge stretch to say if we want to be safer and better quality contacts, we have to make sure that we can communicate well. L is legal authority. And I kind of chuckle when I do talk about this in class because we know oftentimes, sometimes we get ourselves in trouble. And I ask classes all the time, how many of us have ever arrested somebody for disorderly conduct in our careers? Of course, every single hand in the room goes up. And then I ask the next question, like, how many of us have ever gone to court and testified and gotten a conviction on it? And fewer hands are up at the end of that question. And then part of that comes to sometimes when it comes to legal authority, we get frustrated because we can't get what we want. And so our default tends to be, okay, we'll arrest them for disorderly conduct. Now, I kind of make a joke about it, but the reality is when we interact with people, we have got to know more about the law than the people we're interacting with. And so, for example, some people that kind of cause us a little bit of challenge can be not that if someone is a First Amendment auditor, then they have the absolute constitutional right to engage in that. There's not a problem. But you have to know what the law is around that. If I'm an officer and I'm encountering a First Amendment auditor, I need to know exactly what their constitutional rights are. But I also have to know what crosses a line between constitutionally permitted behavior and interference, for example. So I think one of the things we can do from a legal authority is we just have to be absolute cut and dry, black and white on what the law is. It gives us more confidence, and then it ensures that we're only enforcing laws that we have probable cause to arrest for. So I think that's important as well. Same with sovereign citizens and some of these other challenging contacts. We just need to know what our lawful authority is. So we have communication, we have legal authority. E is emotional intelligence. And that is nothing more, nothing less. Every human being, this is not a cop thing. Every human being has emotional, like things that'll push your buttons that we just all have. It might be that our kid won't make their bed or whatever. All human beings have emotional triggers, things that get under our skin that, for lack of it, they just things that piss us off. In the law enforcement world, we have those too that are unique to the job. So part of being good emotional intelligence is simply knowing what those triggers are. understanding that some people out here are going to intentionally push those buttons and that we have a mechanism for dealing with that. So we're aware of what they are, and then we have some self-management strategies. The last two parts of Think Clear. A is adaptive decision making. This is really where I get into more of the tactical aspects of things. So, how do I create discretionary time during contacts? How do I stay left of bang? Be quick but don't hurry. How do I make sure that I have the equipment that I need? Do I have multiple tourniquets on my person? Have I, things like that. So, all of that goes into tactics and how do I approach vehicles and things like that. And then last part. So we've got communication. We have legal authority. Emotional intelligence simply means keeping our emotions in check. Adaptive decision making is all the tactics and tactical things that we use during encounters. And lastly, we say R is respect unconditionally. Now, when I say that, people get, oh, here we go. This is that kumbaya. Everybody deserves a hug. And I don't mean it like that at all. What I mean by that is I'll argue all day that respect is an officer safety issue. And the people who really know this are people that work in our correctional environment. And the reason I say that respect is an officer safety issue is because if we disrespect people, I might not ever personally pay the price for that. But if I disrespect people in the public and start to jade them, the next officer comes in contact with them could be in danger from a person that I disrespected. So we simply call it Think Clear. It's an acronym for communication, legal authority, emotional intelligence, adaptive decision-making, respect unconditionally. And again, if we do those 5 things in most encounters, I think we're safer and we have better quality contacts.
John, I love it. Clear. But I think it illustrates something else as well. I'll tell you just a short story. Just last night, there were 3 of us. 3 of our national board members were sitting at dinner, and here's 3 cops. Do what 3 cops do. They start reminiscing about their days in law enforcement. And I made a comment, and I think it kind of hits home here because I think it's important to say. I made a comment that one of my first days on a job, I remember, just a guy I knew for years, kind of pulled me aside. He says, Pat, just, you need to get another job. This job has changed. And this is 40 years ago. You really ought to look at something else. This job just isn't the same. It's just not the same anymore. And so, maybe you need to do something else. And I say that only because, 40 years ago, the way we did policing needed to change. And Here we are 40 years from that day. And I could easily say, policing is just not the same. It's not the same. But the reality is it shouldn't be. It's constantly evolving. So the clear, the training that you just discussed, the mindset of dealing with calls and dealing with the public. Well, that just shows the evolution of law enforcement where we need to be.
Yeah.
So I just felt like I needed to point that out because I think the reason why law enforcement changed again is because public's changed, the world's changed, and because of that, we need to evolve with it. And one thing, 2 things that cops hate the most: they hate status quo, and they hate change.
Yep, absolutely.
So somewhere in between, we got to figure out a way to I think most are getting it. They get it. They know that our evolution of our profession is vital to our existence. And there are some that we need to pull into it. But whatever it is, we're all going to take this journey together. And
yeah, absolutely.
So I love that. I don't want to shift gears a little bit. We'll come back to some of the law enforcement challenges, but I want to take this in a little bit different. And I feel that training is a part of it. I look at my evolution in law enforcement, the time that I've been here, and I look at just the damage done to law enforcement officers. Let me tell you my observation. My observation is this: that one thing every law enforcement officer in this country has in common is that we all took this job. We all had psych evaluations. We had physical evaluations. We had all of these things necessary to show that we had the right person for a job.
Right.
And then it doesn't take very long that we're on this job and we start seeing law enforcement officers that are struggling. People struggle in a whole lot of different ways. It could be acting out. It could be a number of things. And never once do we ever look and consider the fact that law enforcement officers, because of the demands that are placed on them, are being damaged because of the very job they had. I had a guy say something to me the other day, and I thought it was so profound. It really is. I want you to wrap your head around this. It is difficult to defend humanity without losing a little bit of your own. And I think that is a profound statement. And in reality, we can't do the things that we do and be exposed to things that we do and expect them to not have an impact on us physically. So we see damage to officers. We say, that's a bad officer. That officer's got problems. That officer's got, we have a moral and fiduciary responsibility to fix what is broken.
Yeah.
So I've been pushing this for quite some time. The Fraternal Order of Police, we have our wellness division. It's something, and I love the fact that the public has become more and more, it's becoming more mainstream. We're talking about those issues. I personally, and I'm sure you could say the same thing, I personally know at least a half a dozen my friends, people that I know, some closer than others, who have committed suicide.
Yeah.
Enforcement officers.
Mm-hmm.
The average person will have a traumatic event in their life, maybe one or two, and we know that it affects them. But somehow law enforcement officers may get 80, 100 of those over the course of their career.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have more discussion about the damage that's being done to law enforcement officers. And I think I could think of no better place to start. I would rather let's have those meaningful discussions on PTSD and the effects that it's having on law enforcement officers now, in our academies, in our training, long before we're looking at people that are broken and maybe too much to be able to fix.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in a training standpoint, let's talk about the evolution of being open about these challenges that we have. And more importantly, what we've seen in the way training has changed and hopefully where we see it going, because I don't think it's gone enough to be able to fix these things long before they ever happen.
Yeah, so a couple things here. So your point is well taken about the trauma. How much trauma? And again, let's be honest, it's not just police officers, right? Firefighters, EMTs, and things like that. And you mentioned 80 to 100. I saw a statistic recently that was very close to that. One of the things I think we've got to actually focus on is understanding that when we say officers are exposed to trauma, oftentimes we're thinking of the big ones, meaning a child that has died, or a bad car accident, or God forbid, officer involved shooting, or working a homicide scene and things like that, responding to a suicide. So those are certainly traumas. But I think what happens is that we forget that we're exposed to other types of traumas as well. When you go and you are trying to intervene in a knockdown, drag out domestic fight, I think most officers don't consider that quote unquote trauma, but it is, right? So it's not just the big ones. It's the other things that we deal with, right? The child neglect. So I think part of it is that the number that we use, an officer may be exposed to 80 traumatic events in a career. It's probably way, way more than that. So first of all, I think that's part of it, right? I think when we talk about training, there's a couple things that we teach and talk about. Number one, I think that when we're talking about just a practical application, we need to expose officers in training to as many potential types of scenarios as possible. So obviously, scenario-based, reality-based training scenarios, whether it's handling domestics, officer, shoot, no shoot, or whatever you want to call them. I prefer to call it use of force decision-making scenarios. So it starts with training. We have to get officers more exposed to that because, again, I'm very cautious with the term stress inoculation training because that's been twisted in the training profession as stress them out training. And that's not the idea. It's not to overwhelm them with stress. It's to provide stressors in a training environment so that they learn to deal with those things and they become inoculated to that. That's the idea. There's a huge misconception from a trainer's perspective about what we mean. So stress inoculation training, getting them in an environment where they're seeing some of these traumatic things and they're better able to deal with it. Certainly, there's a direct correlation between wellness and the way we deal with stressors when it comes to how we eat, whether we exercise or not, and then sleep. Sleep is the dirty little secret in law enforcement. And I get beat up over this all the time, constantly. I ask people, how many people, I ask a class, how many of you work 12-hour shifts? Nowadays, it's about 3/4 of the room raise their hands. And I said, you're all lying. And they kind of look at me strange. I'm like, not one of you works a 12-hour shift. I said, you are all working minimum 13, 14-hour shifts, right? You're getting there early, you're finishing paperwork. And so sleep deprivation is a real issue when it comes to it. So now we're exposed to trauma. We're not eating properly. We don't exercise. And then we've got sleep debt piling up on us as well. So I love that we are finally starting to take the approach to some of this and saying, hey, exercise, eat how we eat, making sure we get enough sleep, make sure that we're getting time off, those types of things, and exposing ourselves to low-level trauma in training environments so we can better deal with it. That's all part of things that have to be trained. So that's where I would address it from a training perspective. The other thing is that I think mentoring programs, very few agencies have really good mentoring programs, meaning we tend to just default when I'm a young officer, I just go to a veteran officer. And we both know that can be good or bad, right? If I've got a disgruntled veteran officer who hasn't dealt with their own trauma, that could be a nightmare, right? So I think formal mentoring programs where we I'm not talking about peer support. That's another issue. I'm glad we have that available, but I think formal mentoring programs can be really effective in helping us deal with stress if we've got the right people that are mentoring. So those are a couple things that come to mind, the things that we talk about in our training classes.
It goes back to how I started this. Everybody needs to feel like what they're doing is important and they feel valued. And those mentoring programs do just that. They help reinforce the positives of what we're doing. So,
yeah. Can I throw something in here too? So I listen, I love that, we all know, right? 10 years ago, I mean, probably even less than that. I mean, especially when I came in 94, right? We knew the way we dealt with trauma, right? A senior officer, probably our FTO supervisor, we probably heard it from 10 different people. We'd see something terrible, and it was the whole suck it up, buttercup. It's just a job. Don't let it get to you. So I love the fact that we're changing now, right? So that there's no discussion about that. Officer wellness, officer resiliency, those are hot topics. Everybody's starting to do it. I'd love to see a survey of how many agencies, and maybe the FOP has this data, how many are actually implementing wellness programs. So I love that. We're finally getting it, right? But I have a problem, and I keep calling it the missing link. One of the major police stressors that study after study after study tells us, when you talk to police officers, oftentimes it's not the stress they face out on the street, but it's the internal organizational stressors, the toxic culture and things like that are one of the primary stressors that we have. So you can have all the wellness programs in the world. You can have a CrossFit gym, and you can have meal planning, and you can do all that kind of stuff. And you can have CISM and peer support, which we should have. But man, if we don't address the culture, then isn't all that mitigated? Right? I mean, if we still have if we still have toxic leaders, toxic bosses, we still have internal stressors. Well, then, man, we can't call ourselves a healthy organization just because we have a bunch of programs, and that bothers me too, right? When some agencies tout their wellness and resiliency because they have a bunch of programs. Well, it doesn't tell me whether your officers are well or resilient. It tells me you have a bunch of programs. I need to know, are they engaging in them? How are they participating? What is the culture around that? Do people feel free to participate in that? So I think there's a missing link here that's not getting talked about when we talk about officer safety and wellness, and that's the actual culture of the organization needs to be addressed.
I want to talk about that culture just a little bit and carry that a little further. I think really it is. It's all in a way that you present. A culture is it starts at the top. Everyone feels connected because if you have a good culture, everyone feels that again, it goes back to feeling valued and feeling important. What we're doing is important, and it really is the way to do it. The dynamic you've just described is I often you tell people, see, here's the thing. A law enforcement officer shows up on a scene, and they are going to make a decision with whatever resources they have available to them. They are going to take control, because not taking control can cause harm to themselves and to others. So that is our mindset. We're taught that first day in academy, and we continue to, through our entire career of asserting that authority, or asserting that position, that we are going to take control of the situation so that we can kind of maintain it and kind of guide it in the right direction towards a peaceful resolution. And those same people that may do this call after call after call after call will show up back at the station and reach into the pigeonhole and pull out a memo of something that makes no sense to them because it's change, but it's not change with an explanation that takes you to some understanding of what the overall picture is. That's culture. That's culture. Absolutely. That's understanding rather than, you talk about the traumas to law enforcement and recognize that a big part of that is the way that agencies are run. Well, that's it. That's it. It is, people need to understand. They need to know that what they're doing is important and how they fit into part of it. Very, very good assessment. Just, we'll move on to another topic. But before we do, I want you to look into your crystal ball. You've been training for a long time. Where do you see wellness training going in the future? Where would you like to see it going in the future? And again, I'm going back to where I was at. I don't want to lose another officer. I don't want to lose another friend. And people, they struggle in silent. Didn't even see it coming. That starts early on in an officer's career when they're healthy, to help them deal with these healthy, avenues in order to be able to deal with the struggles that they have that most people don't see.
Yeah. So part of it is, I think you mentioned it earlier, right? Is establishing, there's a great book called Atomic Habits and what they talk. And so I think part of that is we establish it at the academy, right? Financial wellness, physical wellness, mental wellness. And then, so I think that has to start at the academy, and we need to, I don't know if we'll ever get to the point we can mandate physical fitness. But obviously that's a part of it, right? So I think that, I mentioned earlier, we need to, I'll give you a good example. College Station, Texas. It's just happens to be a police department we do a lot of work with, but when I walk in their building, I just feel different because of the culture there. So they've got basically a CrossFit gym. So there's that. Their break areas, you got officers in there doing meal prep. And so wellness and resiliency aren't programs there. It's a way, it's just the way they do things there. And it goes back to culture, right? A part of this is some of our more veteran officers, and I'm not going to stereotype them and put them, I'm not going to put them all in one group, but we know that I think it's time for some of our some of our veteran officers to embrace this. And what I mean by that is, you know how it is. We come out of FTO, we start looking around at these senior officers, and we want to be just like them. We need more examples of those officers that are, they're not working themselves to death with overtime. They eat right. They meal plan. They do those things. And some of those more senior officers, they have an obligation to leave the organization in a better place. I'm a big person. I'm very big on legacy, not popularity, but legacy and how do we leave the organization. So I think our senior officers can play a critical role. And some of that is a shift from the old, hey, suck it up, buttercup, to really being not hyper, but very vigilant about interacting with young people, checking on them, how are they doing, things like that. And again, I know it sounds soft, it sounds like kumbaya, but the reality is, do we want well officers or not? Because that's what it takes, right? And then again, on the culture side of things, we've been working on something. We think that organizational culture, because we talk about that word, and then it doesn't get defined. And so for us, it's something we've been doing across the country. We believe that culture and organizational culture can be, there's three keys. One is we believe in investing in leadership training at all levels, meaning non-supervisory patrol officers, including records, non-supervisors and non-sworn people. We want to invest in leadership training at all levels. That's part of starting a healthy culture. Most leadership dollars are disproportionately spent at the upper ends of the organization. We should be switching that and spending money across the board. And when I say leadership training, I'm not talking about first line supervisor school or new captain school. Nothing wrong with those, but they tend to be very light on leadership and heavy on management, how to manage sick leave and policy and procedure. So we believe in leadership at all levels. The next thing is that we believe that a culture actually has to be intentionally designed. We follow a process that we borrow from a company in New Jersey. It's called Culture by Design, and we help organizations. And what's really cool is when we go in, we have the chief literally sitting at the same table as a police cadet. And patrol and everybody in between, and about groups 7 to 10. And we actually go through what we call a fundamental behavior selection process. And it helps describe the way or the fundamental behaviors of everybody in the organization. So now we operate differently. We talk differently. And then lastly, I think you create great culture through succession planning for talent, not title. Seems like all succession planning in most organizations are all about who's going to get the next position, right? Who's going to make captain, who's going to make major, who's going to be the next chief. Some of us don't want to do that. Some of us want to be patrol officers. So they need training as well. Often referred to as upskilling. How can I invest in people and get them in the career path that they are going to be successful at? That starts reducing those overall stressors. And now I have a wellness program combined with a better culture. I'm going to have a more healthy officer, if that makes sense.
I love a lot of the analogies that you have and just the thought that goes into the culture of agencies and building that next generation of law enforcement and empowering them. At all levels, recognizing that career paths are different, and empowering them with the same skill sets as everyone, across the entire system. So, but what I want to do now is I want to take us back just a little bit into law enforcement. If you look at most of the funding that's coming out of law enforcement, there's a lot of cry across, in every state, at every state legislature, even in federal government, when it comes to some of the funding for law enforcement programs. They all have a buzzword now, and that buzzword is de-escalation.
Yeah,
de-escalation training. Now, my years of law enforcement, we had de-escalation training. We just called it different things.
Yep.
But like anything, it had to evolve too. And you talk a little bit, just share in a training standpoint, kind of the evolution of de-escalation training and what it has turned in today, and how it is important for agencies to embrace.
Yeah. So that's, first of all, I think one of my frustrations when it comes to the topic of de-escalation is that it's so ill-defined by a lot of places, and there seems to be a public misunderstanding about it. So I wrote an article, it might have been 2021, but I wrote an article called "The Truths of De-Escalation." I think, especially with the public, we cannot have an honest conversation with the public unless they can understand these three things to be true. Number one is that de-escalation is an outcome. It's a result, meaning it is not a specific tool or tactic. And there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about that. That is like when we go into a situation that it's something that we can, it's a special tool that we use. It's not. It's a wide range of integrated strategies and tactics designed to help the person de-escalate themselves. The other thing too, one of the big points that I always make, especially when I'm talking to non-law enforcement people, I want them to understand that de-escalation is simply not, it can't be just the absence of force. The truth is sometimes application of reasonable force is the only way to quote unquote de-escalate a situation. If I have an active shooter in a school who's taking people's lives, the only way to de-escalate that situation is through the use of objectively reasonable force. So I wish more people understood that. So for us, it's not a special tool or tactic. It is an outcome. It's a result of us doing something. Now, in best case scenario, there's no force used, but that can't be the end goal. Number two, it's not a verb. It's not something I do to somebody, unless, of course, I'm using force. But it gets misused all the time. We hear people in the public, we hear the media, even law enforcement leaders, the question, why didn't they de-escalate them? As if it's a verb, as if it's something we do to people. All we can really do in most circumstances with people in crisis is create an opportunity, create an environment, timing, tools, tactics, space, whatever it might be. We refer to it as discretionary time. I can attempt to create discretionary time to allow that person to de-escalate themselves. I can't make them do that. So that's, for us, that's important. And the reality is that the sad reality is de-escalation can't be guaranteed. It can't. It's unrealistic to think that we have so many examples of officers actually going overboard, putting themselves in bad, unsafe tactical positions in sometimes misguided attempt to de-escalate where they get themselves hurt. And the reality is there are times when we can do everything right and somebody still ends up getting hurt. So I think we have to, when we're talking about de-escalation training, I think my argument to trainers and agencies across the country are buyer beware, meaning know what's being taught in these classes. Some organizations, they got a nice stamp of approval from another organization, but when you dig into it, some of this training out there is just unrealistic. It doesn't comport with the way officers have to engage people, meaning the end goal, hey, we're going to teach you how to avoid using force at all costs. That's a dangerous proposition. Of course, we don't want to use force, but we can't have a mindset of avoiding force at all costs. And so when it comes to de-escalation training, you really have to make sure that what's being taught is realistic. So that's kind of our approach. We call it our 3 truths of de-escalation. And it's kind of along with some of our tools and tactics. One of my favorite comments when we teach our de-escalation class is at the end of the day, people write in their evaluation, hey, this is not what I thought it was going to be, which is great. That's actually what we want to hear, because they tell us, hey, this is really what we're facing on the street. This is what you talked about today is real. So I think that's the most important thing when it comes to de-escalation.
You know, de-escalation really is just a reasonable and the reasonable management of barriers that stop or that would prevent the de-escalation of an event. And
Absolutely.
understanding those dynamics and not being part of truly understanding and breaking it down and putting it in a way that allows a path for de-escalation. So,
right.
Thank you. Some really great information you share with us. I appreciate all of the effort that you do in helping educate and train the next wave of law enforcement in this country. As we talked about it in a number of different aspects today, law enforcement exists because of the support we have in our community. The world's changing, and so must law enforcement. And these new techniques are important for modern law enforcement, and I appreciate all that you do with it. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. If you could, I'll give you a chance to some final thoughts, and then I'm going to, ask you to tell us a little bit about how, if someone wants to know more about the services that you provide, how can they get in touch with you, and how can they learn more about your services?
Sure. So our mission statement at Command Presence Training is very simple. We educate and empower people everywhere so they can serve the public. That's what we exist to do. Our job is to empower and educate public safety officers across the United States. We do that through leadership training, officer safety training, and instructor development training. And we deliver it literally from Miami Police Department to Fairbanks, Alaska. So we travel the entire United States. But we're driven with that idea. How do we empower and educate people everywhere so that they can serve the public? And people can find out more about us by just simply visiting www.commandpresence.net. I wish it was, the other domain name was taken, so we ended up with .net. Or you can email me at jbostain, which is BOSTAIN, jbostain at commandpresence.net. We'd love to talk about what we're doing as far as building culture. We actually have a summit. We call it the Converge Leadership and Culture Summit, where we do the things I mentioned earlier. We provide leadership training at all levels, and we help organizations design their culture, and we've had great success. So we're doing a lot of fun stuff. I have an incredible cadre of people. I'm truly honored and blessed to have the people that we have. So I'm here. Welcome to answer any questions, and we look forward to the opportunities to work with anybody who is wanting to simply get better at what they're doing.
Great. And John, thanks again for joining us. And to our viewers and our listeners, thank you for tuning in to The Blue View, where we talk about the issues that are so vitally important to the men and women who suit up and show up in communities across this country every single day. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.